Welcome to Stories from the Shadows. I'm Mardell, and here is The Beckoning Fair One by Oliver Onions, Part 3. Without quite knowing how he came to be there, Oleron found himself striding over the loose board he had temporarily placed on the step broken by Miss Bengough. He was hatless and descending the stairs. Not until later did there return to him a hazy memory that he had left the candle burning on the table, had opened the door no wider than was necessary to allow the passage of his body, and had sidled out, closing the door softly behind him. At the foot of the stairs, another shock awaited him. Something dashed with a flurry up from the disused cellars and disappeared out of the door. It was only a cat, but Oleron gave a childish sob. He passed out of the gate and stood for a moment under the to-let boards, plucking foolishly at his lip and looking up at the glimmer of light behind one of his red blinds. Then, still looking over his shoulder, he moved stumblingly up the square. There was a small public house round the corner. Oleron had never entered it, but he entered it now and put down a shilling that missed the counter by inches. "Brandy," he said, and then stooped to look for the shilling. He had the little sawdusted bar to himself. What company there was, carters and laborers and the small tradesmen of the neighborhood, was gathered in the farther compartment, beyond the space where the white-haired landlady moved among her taps and bottles. Oleron sat down on a hardwood settee with a perforated seat, drank half his brandy, and then, thinking he might as well drink it as spill it, finished it. Then he fell to wondering which of the men whose voices he heard across the public house would undertake the removal of his effects on the morrow. In the meantime, he ordered more brandy, for he did not intend to go back to that room where he had left the candle burning. Oh, no! He couldn't have faced even the entry and the staircase with the broken step. Certainly not that pith-white, fascinating room. He would go back, for the present, to his old arrangement of workroom and separate sleeping quarters. He would go to his old landlady at once, presently, when he had finished his brandy, and see if she could put him up for the night. His glass was empty now. He rose, had it refilled, and sat down again. And if anybody asked his reason for removing again, oh, he had reason enough. Reason enough. Nails that put themselves back into wood again and gashed people's hands. Steps that broke when you trod on them, and women who came into a man's place and brushed their hair in the dark, were reasons enough. He was querulous and injured about it all. He had taken the place for himself, not for invisible women to brush their hair in. That lawyer fellow in Lincoln's Inn should be told so, too, and before many hours were out. It was outrageous, letting people in for agreements like that. A cut glass partition divided the compartment where Oleron sat from the space where the white-haired landlady moved, but it stopped 7 or 8 inches above the level of the counter. There was no partition at the farther bar. Presently Oleron, raising his eyes, saw that faces were watching him through the aperture. The faces disappeared when he looked at them. He moved to a corner where he could not be seen from the other bar, but this brought him into line with the white-haired landlady. She knew him by sight, had doubtless seen him passing and repassing, and presently she made a remark on the weather. Oleron did not know what he replied, but it sufficed to call forth the further remark that the winter had been a bad one for influenza, but that the spring weather seemed to be coming at last. Even this slight contact with the commonplace steadied Oleron a little. An idle nascent wonder whether the landlady brushed her hair every night, and if so, whether it gave out those little electric cracklings, was shut down with a snap. And Oleron was better. With his next glass of brandy, he was all for going back to his flat. Not go back, indeed he would go back, They should very soon see whether he was to be turned out of his place like that. He began to wonder why he was doing the rather unusual thing he was doing at that moment, unusual for him, sitting, hatless, drinking brandy in a public house. Suppose he were to tell the white-haired landlady all about it, to tell her that a caller had scratched her hand on a nail and had later had the bad luck to put her foot through a rotten stair, and that he himself, in an old house full of squeaks and creaks and whispers, had heard a minute noise and had bolted from it in fright. What would she think of him? That he was mad, of course. Pshaw, the real truth of the matter was that he hadn't been doing enough work to occupy him. He'd been dreaming his days away, filling his head with a lot of moonshine about a new Romilly, as if the old one was not good enough. And now he was surprised that the devil should enter an empty head. Yes, he would go back. He would take a walk in the air first. He hadn't walked enough lately. And then he would take himself in hand, settle the hash of that 16th chapter of Romilly. Fancy, he had actually been fool enough to think of destroying 15 chapters, and thenceforward he would remember that he had obligations to his fellow men and work to do in the world. There was the matter in a nutshell. He finished his brandy and went out. He had walked for some time before any other bearing of the matter than that on himself occurred to him. At first the fresh air had increased the heady effect of the brandy he had drunk, but afterwards his mind grew clearer than it had been since morning, and the clearer it grew, the less final did his boastful self-assurances become, and the firmer his conviction that when all explanations had been made, there remained something that could not be explained. His hysteria of an hour before had passed. He grew steadily calmer, but the disquieting conviction remained. A deep fear took possession of him. It was a fear for Elsie, for something in his place was inimical to her safety. Of themselves, her two accidents might not have persuaded him of this, but she herself had said it. "I'm not wanted here." And she had declared that there was something wrong with the place. She had seen it before he had. Well and good. One thing stood out clearly, namely, that if this was so, she must be kept away for quite another reason than that which had so confounded him and humiliated Oleron. Luckily, she had expressed her intention of staying away. She must be held to that intention. He must see to it. And he must see to it all the more that he now saw his first impulse, never to set foot in the place again, was absurd. People did not do that kind of thing. With Elsie made secure, he could not, with any respect to himself, suffer himself to be turned out by a shadow, nor even by a danger merely because it was a danger. He had to live somewhere. He would live there. He must return. He mastered the faint chill of fear that came with the decision, and turned in his walk abruptly. Should fear grow on him again, he would perhaps take one more glass of brandy. But by the time he reached the short street that led to the square, he was too late for more brandy. The little public house was still lighted but closed, and one or two men were standing talking on the curb. Oleron noticed that a sudden silence fell on them as he passed, and he noticed further that the long-nosed Barrett, whom he passed a little lower down, did not return his good night. He turned in at the broken gate, hesitated merely an instant in the alley, and then mounted his stairs again. Only an inch of candle remained in the Sheffield stick, and Oleron did not light another one. Deliberately, he forced himself to take it up and to make the tour of his 5 rooms before retiring. It was as he returned from the kitchen, across his little hall, that he noticed that a letter lay on the floor. He carried it into his sitting room and glanced at the envelope before opening it. It was unstamped, and had been put into the door by hand. Its handwriting was clumsy, and it ran from beginning to end without comma or period. Oleron read the first line, turned to the signature, and then finished the letter. It was from the man Barrett, and it informed Oleron that he, Barrett, would be obliged if Mr. Oleron would make other arrangements for the preparing of his breakfast and the cleaning out of his place. The sting lay in the tail, that is to say, the postscript. This consisted of a text of scripture. It embodied an allusion that could only be to Elsie Bengough. A seldom-seen frown had cut deeply into Oleron's brow. So, that was it. Very well. They would see about that on the morrow. For the rest, this seemed merely another reason why Elsie should keep away. Then his suppressed rage broke out. The foul-minded lot! The devil himself could not have given a leer at anything that had ever passed between Paul Oleron and Elsie Bengough. Yet this nosing rascal must be prying and talking. Oleron crumpled the paper up, held it in the candle flame, and then ground the ashes under his heel. One useful purpose, however, the letter had served. It had created in Oleron a wrathful blaze that effectually banished pale shadows. Nevertheless, one other puzzling circumstance was to close the day. As he undressed, he glanced at his bed. The coverlets bore an impression, as if somebody had lain on them. Oleron could not remember that he himself had laid down during the day. Offhand, he would have said that certainly he had not, but after all, he could not be positive. His indignation was for Elsie. Acting possibly with a residue of the brandy in him, excluded all other considerations, and he put out his candle, lay down, and passed immediately into a deep and dreamless sleep, which, in the absence of Mrs. Barrett's morning call, lasted almost round the clock. To the man who pays heed to that voice within him which warns him that twilight and danger are settling over his soul, terror is apt to appear an absolute thing, against which his heart must be safeguarded in a twink, unless there is to take place an altercation in the whole range and scale of his nature. Mercifully, he has never far to look for safeguards of the immediate and small, and common and momentary things of life, of usages and observances, and modes and conventions. He builds up fortifications against the powers of darkness. He is even content that not terror only, but joy also should for working purposes be placed in the category of the absolute things. And the last treason he will commit will be that breaking down of terms and limits that strikes not at one man, but at the welfare of the souls of all. In his own person, Oleron began to commit this treason. He began to commit it by admitting the inexplicable and horrible to an increasing familiarity. He did it insensibly, unconsciously, by a neglect of the things that he now regarded it as an impertinence in Elsie Bengough to have prescribed. 2 months before, the words "a haunted house" applied to his lovely bemusing dwelling would have chilled his marrow. Now, his scale of sensation becoming depressed, he could ask, "Haunted by what?" and remain unconscious that horror, when it can be proved to be relative, by so much loses its proper quality. He was setting aside the landmarks. Mist and confusion had begun to enwrap him, and he was conscious of nothing so much as of a voracious inquisitiveness. He wanted to know. He was resolved to know. Nothing but the knowledge would satisfy him, and craftily he cast about for means whereby he might attain it. He might have spared his craft. The matter was the easiest imaginable. As in time past he had known in his writing moments when his thoughts had seemed to rise of themselves and to embody themselves in words not to be altered afterwards. So now the questions he put himself seemed to be answered even in the moment of their asking. There was exhilaration in the swift, easy processes. He had known no such joy in his own power since the days when his writing had been a daily freshness and a delight to him. It was almost as if the course he must pursue was being dictated to him. And the first thing he must do, of course, was to define the problem. He defined it in terms of mathematics. Granted that he had not the place to himself, granted that the old house had inexpressibly caught and engaged his spirit, granted that by virtue of the common denominator of the place, this unknown co-tenant stood in some relation to himself. What next? Clearly, the nature of the other numerator must be ascertained. And how? Ordinarily, this would not have seemed simple, but to Oleron it was now pellucidly clear. The key, of course, lay in his half-written novel, or rather in both Romillys, the old and the proposed new one. A little while before, Oleron would have thought himself mad to have embraced such an opinion. Now he accepted the dizzying hypothesis without a quiver. He began to examine the first and second Romillys. From the moment of his doing so, the thing advanced by leaps and bounds. Swiftly he reviewed the history of the Romilly of the 15 chapters. He remembered clearly now that he had found her insufficient on the very first morning on which he had sat down to work in his new place. Other instances of his aversion leaped up to confirm his obscure investigation. There had come the night when he had hardly forborne to throw the whole thing in the fire, and the next morning he had begun the planning of the new Romilly. It had been on that morning that Mrs. Barrett, overhearing him humming the brief phrase that the dripping of the tap the night before had suggested, had informed him that he was singing some air he had never in his life heard before, called the Beckoning Fair One. The Beckoning Fair One. With scarcely a pause in thought, he continued. The first Romilly having been definitely thrown over, the second had instantly fastened herself upon him, clamoring for birth in his brain. He even fancied now, looking back, that there had been something like passion, hate almost in the supplanting, and that more than once a stray thought, given to his discarded creation, had— it was astonishing how credible Oleron found the almost unthinkable idea— had offended the supplanter. Yet that a malignancy almost homicidal should be extended to his fiction's poor mortal prototype. In spite of his inuring to a scale in which the horrible was now a thing to be fingered and turned this way and that, a good God broke from Oleron. This intrusion of the first Romilly's prototype into his thought again was a factor that for the moment brought his inquiry into the nature of his problem to a termination. The mere thought of Elsie was fatal to anything abstract. For another thing, he could not yet think of that letter of Barrett's, nor of a little scene that had followed it, without mounting of color and a quick contraction of the brow. For wisely or not, he had had that argument out at once. Striding across the square on the following morning, he had bearded Barrett on his own doorstep. Coming back again a few minutes later, he had been strongly of opinion that he had only made matters worse. The man had been vagueness itself. He had not been to be either challenged or browbeaten into anything more definite than a muttered farrago in which the words, "certain things, Mrs. Barrett, respectable house, if the cap fits, proceedings that shall be nameless," had been constantly repeated. "Not that I make any charge," he concluded. "Charge?" Oleron had cried. "Well, I have my ideas of things, as I don't doubt you have yours." "Ideas? Mine?" Oleron had cried wrathfully, immediately dropping his voice as heads had appeared at windows of the square. "Look you here, my man. You've an unwholesome mind which probably you can't help, but a tongue which you can help and shall, if there is a breath of this repeated." "I'll not be talked to on my own doorstep like this by anybody," Barrett had blustered. "You shall, and I'm doing it. Don't you forget there is a God above all who has said, 'You're a low scandal-monger, and so forth, continuing badly what was already badly begun. Oleron had returned wrathfully to his own house, and thenceforward, looking out of his windows, had seen Barrett's face at odd times, lifting blinds or peering round curtains, as if he sought to put himself in possession of heaven knew what evidence, in case it should be required of him. The unfortunate occurrence made certain minor differences in Oleron's domestic arrangements. Barrett's tongue, he gathered, had already been busy. He was looked at askance by the dwellers of the square, and he judged it better, until he should be able to obtain other help, to make his purchases of provisions a little farther afield, rather than at the small shops of the immediate neighborhood. For the rest, housekeeping was no new thing to him, and he would resume his old bachelor habits. Besides, he was deep in certain rather abstruse investigations in which it was better that he should not be disturbed. He was looking out of his window one midday, rather tired, not very well, and glad that it was not very likely he would have to stir out of doors, when he saw Elsie Bengough crossing the square towards his house. The weather had broken. It was a raw and gusty day, and she had to force her way against the wind that set her ample skirts bellying about her opulent figure, and her veil spinning and streaming behind her. Oleron acted swiftly and instinctively. Seizing his hat, he sprang to the door and descended the stairs at a run. A sort of panic had seized him. She must be prevented from setting foot in the place. As he ran along the alley, he was conscious that his eyes went up to the eaves, as if something drew them. He did not know that a slate might not accidentally fall. He met her at the gate and spoke with curious volubleness. "Oh, this is really too bad, Elsie. Just as I'm urgently called away. I'm afraid it can't be helped, though, and that you'll have to think me an inhospitable beast." He poured it out just as it came into his head. She asked if he was going to town. "Yes, yes, to town," he replied. "I've got to call on Chambers. You know Chambers, don't you? No, I remember you don't. A big man you once saw me with. I ought to have gone yesterday, and—" This he felt to be a brilliant effort. "And he's going out of town this afternoon, to Brighton. I had a letter from him this morning." He took her arm and led her up the square. She had to remind him that his way to town lay in the other direction. "Ah, of course! How stupid of me!" he said with a little loud laugh. "I'm so used to going the other way with you. Of course, it's the other way to the bus. Will you come along with me?" "I am so awfully sorry it's happened like this." They took the street to the bus terminus. This time Elsie bore no signs of having gone through interior struggles. If she detected anything unusual in his manner, she made no comment, and he, seeing her calm, began to talk less recklessly through silences. By the time they reached the bus terminus, nobody, seeing the pallid-faced man without an overcoat and the large, ample-skirted girl at his side, would have supposed that one of them was ready to sink on his knees for thankfulness that he had, as he believed, saved the other from a wildly unthinkable danger. They mounted to the top of the bus, Oleron protesting that he should not miss his overcoat, and that he found the day, if anything, rather oppressively hot. They sat down on a front seat. Now that this meeting was forced upon him, he had something else to say that would make demands upon his tact. It had been on his mind for some time, and was indeed peculiarly difficult to put. He revolved it for some minutes, and then, remembering the success of his story of a sudden call to town, cut the knot of his difficulty with another lie. "I'm thinking of going away for a little while, Elsie," he said. She merely said, "Oh?" "Somewhere for a change. I need a change. I think I shall go tomorrow or the day after. Yes, tomorrow, I think." "Yes," she replied. "I don't quite know how long I shall be," he continued. "I shall have to let you know when I am back." "Yes, let me know," she replied in an even tone. The tone was, for her, suspiciously even. He was a little uneasy. "You don't ask me where I'm going," he said with a little cumbrous effort to rally her. She was looking straight before her past the bus driver. "I know," she said. He was startled. "How do you know?" "You're not going anywhere," she replied. He found not a word to say. It was a minute or so before she continued in the same controlled voice she had employed from the start. "You're not going anywhere. You weren't going out this morning. You only came out because I appeared. Don't behave as if we were strangers, Paul." A flush of pink had mounted to his cheeks. He noticed that the wind had given her the pink of early rhubarb. Still, he found nothing to say. "Of course you ought to go away," she continued. "I don't know whether you look at yourself often in the glass, but you're rather noticeable. Several people have turned to look at you this morning, so of course you ought to go away. But you won't, and I know why." He shivered, coughed a little, then broke silence. "Well, then, if you know, there's no use in continuing this discussion," he said curtly. "Not for me, perhaps, but there is for you," she replied. "Shall I tell you what I know?" "No," he said in a voice slightly raised. "No?" she asked, her round eyes earnestly on him. "No." Again he was getting out of patience with her. Again he was conscious of the strain. Her devotion and fidelity and love plagued him. She was only humiliating both herself and him. It would have been bad enough had he ever by word or deed given her cause for thus fastening herself on him. But there, that was the worst of that kind of life for a woman. Women such as she, business women, in and out of offices all the time, always, whether they realized it or not, made comradeship a cover for something else. They accepted the unconventional status, came and went freely as men did, were honestly taken by men at their own valuation. And then it turned out to be the other thing after all, and they went and fell in love. No wonder there was gossip in shops and squares and public houses. In a sense, the gossipers were in the right of it. Independent, yet not efficient, with some of womanhood's graces forgone, and yet with all the woman's hunger and need, half sophisticated, yet not wise. Oleron was tired of it all, and it was time he told her so. "I suppose," he said tremblingly, looking down between his knees, "I suppose the real trouble is the life women who earn their own living are obliged to lead." He could not tell in what sense she took the lame generality. She merely replied, "I suppose so." "It can't be helped," he continued, "but you do sacrifice a good deal." She agreed, a good deal. And then she added, after a moment, "What, for instance?" "You may or may not be gradually attaining a new status, but you're in a false position today." It was very likely, she said. She hadn't thought of it much in that light. "And," he continued desperately, "you're bound to suffer. Your most innocent acts are misunderstood, motives you never dreamed of are attributed to you, and in the end it comes to—" He hesitated a moment, and then took the plunge. "To the sidelong look and the leer." She took his meaning with perfect ease. She merely shivered a little as she pronounced the name. "Barrett." His silence told her the rest. Anything further that was to be said must come from her. It came as the bus stopped at a stage and fresh passengers mounted the stairs. "You'd better get down here and go back, Paul," she said. "I understand perfectly. Perfectly. It isn't Barrett. You'd be able to deal with Barrett. It's merely convenient for you to say it's Barrett. I know what it is. But you said I wasn't to tell you that. Very well. But before you go, let me tell you why I came up this morning." In a dull tone, he asked her why. Again she looked straight before her as she replied, I came to force your hand. Things couldn't go on as they have been going, you know, and now that's all over." "All over?" he repeated stupidly. "All over. I want you now to consider yourself, as far as I'm concerned, perfectly free. I make only one reservation." He hardly had the spirit to ask her what that was. "If I merely needed you," she said, "please don't give that a thought. That's nothing. I shan't come near for that. But," she dropped her voice, "if you're in need of me, Paul, and I shall know if you are, and you will be, then I shall come no matter what cost. You understand that?" He could only groan. "So that's understood," she concluded. "And I think that's all. Now go back. I should advise you to walk back, for you're shivering. Goodbye." She gave him a cold hand, and he descended. He turned on the edge of the curb as the bus started again. For the first time in all the years he had known her, she parted from him with no smile and no wave of her long arm. He stood on the curb, plunged in misery, looking after her as long as she remained in sight. But almost instantly, with her disappearance, he felt the heaviness lift a little from his spirit. She had given him his liberty, true. There was a sense in which he had never parted with it. But now was no time for splitting hairs. He was free to act, and all was clear ahead. Swiftly the sense of lightness grew on him. It became a positive rejoicing in his liberty, and before he was halfway home, he had decided what must be done next. The vicar of the parish in which his dwelling was situated lived within 10 minutes of the square. To his house Oleron turned his steps. It was necessary that he should have all the information he could get about this old house, with the insurance marks and the sloping to let boards, and the vicar was the person most likely to be able to furnish it. This last preliminary out of the way, and ha ha ha, Oleron chuckled, things might be expected to happen. But he gained less information than he had hoped for. The house, the vicar said, was old. But there needed no vicar to tell Oleron that. It was reputed, Oleron pricked up his ears, to be haunted. But there were few old houses about which some such rumor did not circulate among the ignorant, and the deplorable lack of faith of the modern world, the vicar thought, did not tend to dissipate these superstitions. For the rest, his manner was the soothing manner of one who prefers not to make statements without knowing how they will be taken by his hearer. Oleron smiled as he perceived this. "You may leave my nerves out of the question," he said. "How long has the place been empty?" "A dozen years, I should say," the vicar replied. "And the last tenant, did you know him?" "Or her?" Oleron was conscious of a tingling of his nerves as he offered the vicar the alternative of sex. "Him," said the vicar, "a man. If I remember rightly, his name was Madley, an artist. He was a great recluse, seldom went out of the place, and—" The vicar hesitated and then broke into a little gush of candor. "And since you appear to have come for this information, and since it is better that the truth should be told than that garbled version should get about, I don't mind saying that this man Madley died there under somewhat unusual circumstances. It was ascertained at the post-mortem that there was not a particle of food in his stomach, although he was found to be not without money, and his frame was simply worn out. Suicide was spoken of, but you'll agree with me that deliberate starvation is, to say the least, an uncommon form of suicide. An open verdict was returned." "Ah," said Oleron, "and does there happen to be any comprehensive history of this parish?" "No, partial ones only. I myself am not guiltless of having made a number of notes on its purely ecclesiastical history, its registers, and so forth, which I shall be happy to show you if you would care to see them, but it is a large parish. I have only one curate, and my leisure, as you will readily understand." The extent of the parish and the scantiness of the vicar's leisure occupied the remainder of the interview, and Oleron thanked the vicar, took his leave, and walked slowly home. He walked slowly for a reason, twice turning away from the house within a stone's throw of the gate, and taking another turn of 20 minutes or so. He had a very ticklish piece of work now before him. It required the greatest mental concentration. It was nothing less than to bring his mind, if he might, into such a state of unpreoccupation and receptivity that he should see the place as he had seen it on that morning when, his removal accomplished, he had sat down to begin the 16th chapter of the first Romilly. For could he recapture that first impression, he now hoped for far more from it. Formerly he had carried no end of mental lumber. Before the influence of the place had been able to find him out at all, it had had the inertia of those dreary chapters to overcome. No results had shown. The process had been one of slow saturation, charging, filling up to a brim. But now he was light, unburdened, rid at last, both of that Romilly and of her prototype. Now for the new unknown, coy, jealous, bewitching, beckoning fair. At 2:30 of the afternoon, he put his key into the Yale lock, entered, and closed the door behind him. His fantastic attempt was instantly and astonishingly successful. He could have shouted with triumph as he entered the room. It was as if he had escaped into it, once more as in the days when his writing had had a daily freshness and wonder and promise for him. He was conscious of that new ease and mastery and exhilaration and release. The air of the place seemed to hold more oxygen, as if his own specific gravity had changed. His very tread seemed less ponderable. The flowers in the bowls, the fair proportions of the meadowsweet-colored panels and moldings, the polished floor, and the lofty and faintly starred ceiling fairly laughed their welcome. Oleron actually laughed back and spoke aloud. "Oh, you're pretty, pretty," he flattered it. Then he lay down on his couch. He spent that afternoon as a convalescent who expected a dear visitor might have spent it, in a delicious vacancy, smiling now and then as if in his sleep, and ever lifting drowsy and contented eyes to his alluring surroundings. He lay thus until darkness came, and with darkness, the nocturnal noises of the old house. But if he waited for any specific happening, he waited in vain. He waited similarly in vain on the morrow, maintaining, though with less ease, that sensitized, plate-like condition of his mind. Nothing occurred to give it an impression. Whatever it was which he so patiently wooed, it seemed to be both shy and exacting. Then, on the third day, he thought he understood. A look of gentle drollery and cunning came into his eyes, and he chuckled. "Oh, well, if the wind sits in that quarter, we must see what else there is to be done. What is there now? No, I won't send for Elsie. We don't need a wheel to break the butterfly on. We won't go to those lengths, my butterfly." He was standing musing, thumbing his lean jaw, looking aslant. Suddenly he crossed to his hall, took down his hat, and went out. "My lady is coquettish, is she? Well, we'll see what a little neglect will do," he chuckled as he went down the stairs. He sought a railway station, got into a train, and spent the rest of the day in the country. Oh yes, Oleron thought he was the man to deal with fair ones who beckoned and invited. and then took refuge in shyness and hanging back. He did not return until after 11 that night. "Now, my fair beckoner," he murmured as he walked along the alley and felt in his pocket for his keys. Join me next week on Stories from the Shadows for our final story in this series. It's going to be horribly good.